to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Terminal Philosophy to discuss the Alex Jones and Graham Hancock theory of the past. So Tim, what is the Alex Jones and Graham Hancock theory of the past?
So today we're joined with Terminal Philosophy for a third time, and we're doing, in a way, the same iteration of three different topics, the same topic. The first topic was on taboo topics. We talked about Israel. We talked about certain theories of scientism. We talked about other things. The second edition was the blind spots of historians. And two popular thinkers who bring these ideas together are probably Graham Hancock and Alex Jones. They both get accused of the C word, which is conspiracy theory. And I think on a functional taxonomy, they both have a lot of similar features. That they both represent popular figures, best-selling authors. They are both best-selling authors. If you look at popular books, Jones is not an author. Hancock is an author. They're well read, and they're both very nice people too, from all the reports of people around them. And they're both popularized by Joe Rogan. So they're both sort of public conspiracy. They get the conspiracy. Now, Jones, of course, have two different topics. Jones works with the present, subplots of the U.S. government, MK Ultra, Vietnam, 9/11, and of course Hancock is a much more distant past. But I thought it'd be interesting to talk about them together as a phenomena. I think they're interesting because they sort of form a corrective, at minimum, to the mainstream narrative here. If I had a punishment for the Branch Covidians that would be enacted in the future, I would say the only way you could tell the history, as on our previous episode we talked about the New York Times history problem, like in college you have databases, they only consist of like New York Times. How could you tell a history with just using New York Times? Well, my punishment would be that you could only tell the history of the last 2 years with using Infowars.com. I think that would be an interesting history of the past 2 years, if you can only use that as your source material. So a lot of the attacks to them are characterological or ad hominem in nature. So terminal philosophy, in broad terms, what do you think the role of people like Alex Jones and Graham Hancock are in the broader society, in the broader narrative? In a way, they're sort of like institutions into themselves. They have public profit. They get accused of being profit-hungry grifters, just trying to make a buck. We did an episode on grifting. Like, what do you think is the sort of role? Should we? I like to consider myself self-aware, but I don't believe every word they say. But I think they're, number one, entertaining, and number two, they get to a lot of truths. I think on the ancient questions, there are some questions that mainstream ancient historians just seem unwilling to even ask. Like, this building looks really complicated. You're saying you're using straw tools to build it? That seems weird. How can that be done? No one today could even build it. Just simple questions like those, to me, are really interesting. And it's sort of childlike mentality, which in this is in a good way, of curiosity. What is your broad terms, your opinion on them? And thanks for having it on, Terminal.
Right. Well, thank you again for having me on your podcast. This topic brings in, I would say, all sorts of interesting questions about academic bias, entertainment, legitimate or illegitimate forms of research, things like cult of personality of entertainment figures and the ways in which studies are funded and ultimately made to be biased, so on and so forth. So I think in the case of whether or not Hancock and Jones are something of like whether or not they are legitimate theorists or whether they're entertainers, I think, when I think of a theorist, I think of someone who's, trained at a school or at an academy somewhere, at a legitimate university, and they've been put through classes about how to research things, primary sources, secondary sources, how to cite things properly, and compare their work and claims of the past or claims of the present to other scholars and things like that. So in this sense, are they quote unquote legitimate theorists? Well, I would say no. However, that doesn't necessarily delegitimize everything they have said or have put forth in their writings and their platforms. I think that you are right. You're definitely onto something when you stated that they are some sort of they're some sort of corrective function in relation to the government-funded academies of the West and to the newspapers of today and things like that. For Hancock, now I haven't read his books, but I did a bit of research on his work, and I watched several videos about him. For example, the Joe Rogan podcast episode, or at least I maybe he's been on twice or three times, but I did watch one episode. And of course, I've been watching Alex Jones for a while, if anything, for entertainment for several years. But I think when you take a survey of their work, because it's easy to be overwhelmed by sort of the kind of the flashbang atmosphere of Alex Jones, or the sort of the depth of Hancock's work. When you take a real big step back and you look at this, I think that both of them fit somewhere in between full-blown entertainment and something of an alternative to the academics of the West. Because while I don't necessarily despise academia and things like that, I think we can all agree that academia has something of a cultural problem and something of a left-wing bias problem. And unfortunately, when this question was asked to Noam Chomsky about 2 years ago, and this was just before COVID, when he was asked questions about whether or not the academia has some sort of left-wing bias, well, he basically flat out denied that it was that was even a problem to begin with, because he said that he had coworkers who were more right-leaning and conservative, and they had no problem in keeping their job, and they had no problem getting tenure. So what's the big deal? So that was fairly frustrating. And at that point, it's like, okay, maybe someone needs to put Grandpa to bed. But yes, in the case of Jones and Hancock, are they like these, do they wear $400 black turtlenecks, and they're always in the university archives, and they're just constantly doing research, and they're worried about losing some sort of position? And are they, do they carry themselves like a writer from the New Yorker? Well, no, definitely not. Are they only pro wrestling figures that are just out for money? Well, no, not that either. I think they're somewhere in between. And in the case with Hancock, he is interesting because while he's not an Ancient Aliens guy, at least not that I had come across, his central thesis is something of the following, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I think that it's, before the Sumerians and the ancient Egyptians, he claims that there was some sort of, I believe, something like a global spanning ancient civilization which spread, mathematics and architecture and language and things like that to different places of the world, and that would explain the pyramids of Giza and all sorts of other archaeological phenomenon throughout the world. Now, he is definitely he's not liked very well with the mainstream archaeological community, because they claim he can't back any of his claims up with tangible evidence. He thinks, and then Graham Hancock thinks, that the mainstream archaeology is too entrenched in certain dogmas to even ask certain questions. So yeah, it's this interesting debate. And the only thing I would say to that is that you should be able to at least look into these questions, pre-Sumerian, pre-Egyptian civilizations. I think that's fine. Now, it is a bit of academia's fault that left open this gap of inquiry, because basically after the 1950s, as I understand it, in the 20th century of archaeology, that is when I think there's this this theory called Clovis first theory, which that is I believe it's in reference to the migratory patterns of humans throughout several millennia across Central Asia, across the Bering Strait, and then into North America. That didn't become more established and popular, I believe, until the 1940s or 50s. And then since then, that has been the most popular theory about how humans have migrated into the North and South American continents. He believes that they came, I think that those populations became established from like a seafaring people as opposed to from the Bering Strait. So, but yes, now it's hard for me to comment on just how much evidence is really available for Graham Hancock, but because academia made only the Bering Strait theory or hypothesis popular and quietly, not quietly, they really made that theory the most acceptable one to publish and write and research about. Well, then they leave non-academic sources who can end up being popular in the public, like Graham Hancock, to come forth. So I'm not saying it's completely their fault, but once they start gatekeeping, perhaps unnecessarily on certain subjects, then they're going to create these certain types of phenomena. And I'll finish up here soon, but I think this sort of same phenomenon also applies to Alex Jones. I think after the Walter Cronkite era of news, and I think Walter Cronkite might be a bit overrated himself, but I think after that era of journalism, which was kind of more just, it was a bit more boring. It was more like what Right Ruminations and Todd Lewis sometimes refer to as 1970s public access television, where things are just a bit more analytical and more dry and longer. And, you remember William F. Buckley with his show where, the show might last, I don't know, half an hour. I don't even remember how long it was, but he'll bring on Marxist professors or libertarians or nationalists and then, it's this drawn out discussion about, political science and history and philosophy. Well, nowadays it's this pro wrestling, one-upsmanship. And so when that becomes the dominant way of reporting the news, well, then that's going to leave all sorts of gaps and vacuums beyond that perimeter, and figures like Alex Jones will emerge. So, yeah, I would say those are my initial thoughts on those two individuals.
On Hancock, I think his use is, at least in the popular domain, is to increase the awareness of how advanced relatively ancient civilizations are. Him, similar in certain respects to an older guy, Eric van Daniken, who's had, I think, similar ideas, although I think Daniken was the alien guy. But they are interesting to raise sort of how sort of technologically sophisticated these relatively ancient civilizations are. Now, it may well be the case that in the academic literature that's well known, but that's certainly not the public, the general sort of public perception of such ancient civilizations. So I do think it's an interesting corrective there. I'm not entirely sure of Hancock's basis for this sort of Sumerian civilization. But it would seem to be the case, as you discussed, as mentioned in another episode with Todd Lewis on history, is that it seems to be de rigueur in the historical community these days to ignore written records as much as possible, because basically if you wrote it down, it's a lie. And so you must have hard physical evidence. It's almost like it's kind of like positivism for history. It must be empirical. And by empirical, we mean stuff that people haven't written down, but like natural things we can kind of observe. And I think that may be one aspect with the archaeological aspects. I mean, so for instance, Plato claims, with respect to Atlantis, that he was told this by Solon, who was told it by the Egyptians. Now, of course, this could be false, but Plato seems to think it's true. Well, whether it is or not is another question. But it's the mere fact that there's a general disdain for written records. Also, as well, anything which points to early civilizations being pretty darn advanced is sort of a priori ignored because it goes against the general evolutionary view of history. And by evolutionary, I mean as in following biological evolution, as we're going from sort of like simple to complex. And so anything that's pretty early, which is pretty advanced, is something that we cannot consider to be true because it contradicts the general sort of the hermeneutic of history. There we go. I can trademark that. That would seem to be how that works. So I think Hancock in that respect is interesting. Jones, now for all his bombast, if you actually listen to what he says, most of the things he references are historically verified events. Operation Northwoods, MK Ultra, etc. Is like these things happened. I mean, Bohemian Grove. Does Bohemian Grove exist? Yes. Do they sacrifice things to an owl god? Yes. If you'd said this before he took his video camera, would you have said he was insane? Yes. Is it true? Yes. They do that. Now, whether his interpretation of what happens at Bohemian Grove is true is another question. And the general theory about the elites being involved with the occult back to the Babylonians, etc., is another question. But a lot of Alex Jones, particularly more of his historical stuff, seems to be pretty darn accurate from what I can observe. Now, his more recent stuff, you can probably go, well, that's a bit like, so his earlier work on 9/11, etc. You could go, well, yeah. I think a lot of the time Jones is a talk show host. Basically, he's a provocateur. That's what he gets listened to, and that's I think why he's the way he is. His mind does seem to be a scattergun. He has an interesting interview with Michael Malice, and Michael Malice just tries to keep him on the straight and narrow throughout, and Jones is trying to go everywhere and anywhere. But I think that Jones is generally interesting and he's worth listening to. He's not, I'm saying not right in everything, but he isn't just this airheaded know nothing, despite what CNN and MSNBC might claim. So those have been my overall comments on Jones and Hancock.
This interview is progressing as the way I wanted. I think there are certain interesting backdoor ways in which Alex Jones and Graham Hancock sometimes are pounding away at the same mountain at just different sections, just a very large mountain at just different sections. Both of them, as far as your comment about Jones being a sort of talk show host, he is. I mean, in that way, he is scatterbrained. He's a guy. There's an Alfred Hitchcock movie called The Man Who Knew Too Much. In a way, Alex Jones has just been fed. Has probably just read too many different things. I think there's a certain Stockholm syndrome where he's just sort of. It's hard to exist if he knows certain things, like he'll make turning the frogs gay or something like that. I mean, that's not exactly true from my understanding, but it's basically the case. So even the sort of more things that he gets ridiculed, there are more or less. And terminal philosophy brought up the Noam Chomsky line, like, why is there a problem here? The problem doesn't even exist. I mean, I know David Brooks or somebody like that works at the New York Times or wherever, and he can fit in. Or so they bring up some milquetoast, conservative who says nothing of any interest or thing like that, and they'll use that as evidence that people can get along. That is very frustrating, to say the least. As far as the history point here, I think this will have to go back to our second episode here on actually both episodes, the taboo topic ones. I don't think there's two thinkers here that sort of throw two thinkers who aren't outright considered bad guys, because you get all these sort of buzzwords, white supremacist, racist, thrown out, and on both accounts, I don't think any of them really actually identify with that. I mean, for one thing, Graham Hancock has a wife who's Jamaican, I think, and I mean they might be black, they might be considered white by now.
She's Malaysian. She's Malaysian.
Okay, well, that's probably at this point that's multi-ethnic whitehood or whatever BS they're gonna say. But and as far as Jones, I've never, Douglas Lane, who runs Zero Books. This is like an old video. I cannot find it. But this is what Doug Lane of Zero Books. He's a Marxist. He said in like 28 or old video. He said that I basically agree with the core message of Alex Jones. The government's out to get you. The government's done terrible things. That's rough. I'm paraphrasing much, but he basically said he agrees with it. And what's interesting is, and this is what I think is interesting, on an a priori basis, if you read the Mises and Rothbard, and this Moldbug points that out, and Marx in a backdoor way agrees in a way with it, but just have different boogeymen. If you read, it's a theory of central banks creating wars. And what's Graham Hancock's? What's Alex Jones's specialty? Excesses of U.S. government, the military-industrial complex. So I think there's a sort of he's sort of like as Moldbug points out, he's sort of like a very much watered-down version of Rothbard. I mean, he's sort of like a pop version of that. And as far as Hancock is concerned, I think Swithin, I think it was Swithin who touched that about, or was it Terminal, about being progress. The fact that a society that was 10,000 years ago exists with technology is probably one of the most heterodox ideas you could generate. Now, maybe the alien stuff is neither here nor there. It could just be an advanced civilization. But the fact that there was travel, that's very much contra the sort of progressive zeitgeist which dominates academia, which Chomsky himself is somewhat a part of to some extent. I mean, in a way, you could view Hancock as a conservative theorist of decline. Now he might not identify as that, but in a way, if you think that certain societies were more advanced in the past, so that would be my second comments here. If you care to elaborate here, Terminal, and anything you disagree with or agree with, or then we can move on to some other questions.
Sure. Well, yeah, I think both of your comments are quite spot on in regards to both men. I think one thing to address too is that I don't think that these guys are just intentional grifters, and that they don't actually. I don't believe that they don't actually are invested into their thesis or to their craft. I really do believe that they believe what they put out into the world, and I think you can tell this by just the ways in which they express themselves. The lengthy interview with Joe Rogan that Joe Rogan had with Graham Hancock. It's difficult for me to believe that these guys are all just like these Kevin Spacey types in House of Cards, and they're really just manipulating everybody, and they're just out there for money. I don't see that. Those people are certainly out there, but I don't think that that's the case for these guys. Even if they're wrong about everything, I don't think that they're just out there for money. I will say that, as Swithin said earlier, for all the bombast and bluster and the for all the hyperbole that Jones can put out, I think that in general, if anything, he's fairly well versed in U.S. 20th century political history. His early radio career was pretty good, and by which I mean there was a lot of discussion about things like Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the U.S. Iran-Contra, MK Ultra, and about a million other things. Jones would really talk about a lot of taboo subjects, and to my knowledge, it's like he's never said anything. I've never actually come across anything that he said that's just like openly, overtly racist either. He's been, accused of that here and there, but not heavily. And I did look for, Alex Jones, actual overt racism. And then, I found some articles, but it wasn't like this smoking gun thing. I found him criticizing Black Lives Matter and Antifa and, things like that. And he thinks that, Black Lives Matter are basically, shock troops for the establishment. And I think he's actually right about that. He can't, I personally do, but that's not racist, but of course I think we would agree that, what passes as racism today is so broad and so nebulous that it's definitely lost its meaning. I mean, everyone's a Nazi. I mean, if you're a willing stay-at-home mother, you're a Nazi. Or I mean, the definition's basically just been butchered and spread so thin that it casts too wide of a net and doesn't mean anything anymore. So. But yes, and Jones, I would say too, because he has talked about so many taboo subjects in 9/11 and things like that, a lot of his followers, it's a pretty multiracial lot. I mean, he's to my understanding, he's never been this like white nationalist guy. He's never come across that way. I mean, if anything, he's more of just like this anti-big government, right-leaning guy in general. And I think, that he's much more relatable to average people than many of the elites and many, academics and things like that. Obviously he's very extroverted, but, Alex Jones is the type of guy that could probably walk into some dive bar somewhere in the United States and just start sipping beers, and you could just talk with these people, and he would end up laughing, and everyone's slapping backs with each other. Whereas I know that this isn't the case for all academics, but academics are typically very introverted and sometimes hard to connect with, and so
I'll just interrupt here. I'll give you an example, or like a CNN host like Don Lemon or one of those characters, or the Cuomo guy. I wouldn't see them going.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Jones can hold his own out in the public. I think I'll go as far to say this. I mean, Jones has far more in common with, just rural people of the world and, the goat herders of Kazakhstan than any of these sanctimonious, condescending CNN anchors do. So I think that that's something that goes to his credit, and that sort of kind of comes after you sort of absorb Alex Jones for several hours or maybe several months or years, you can tend to pick up on that he's this well-intentioned guy and that he just hates government corruption, and he is trying to be a legitimate voice against government overreach and things like that, even though he's ripping his shirt off sometimes and it's getting and the atmosphere is just near circus like. But I think he also knows that he's also a brand too. He's not just another person out there with political opinions. He himself is also a brand that has to be managed, and he knows that when people tune in to listen to Alex Jones, that they want to hear some screaming, and they want to, pound their fist with him that, this damn U.S. government is just so out of control. So yeah, those are just some more comments about Alex Jones. Now as far as Hancock, I really do think that I think he definitely intends well, and I don't think that he's trying. He's just out there for the money. I will say that one interesting subject that Graham Hancock is sort of involved with, or at least that his work has been involved with over the years, and this is something that Todd Lewis and I have discussed in private, is that within archaeology, carbon dating is an interesting subject, because carbon dating now, and I'm not even talking about the folks who criticize it that are like young Earth creationists or something like that. I'm actually talking about mainstream archaeologists. These are unfortunate, some of these, some mainstream archaeologists have a lot of problems with carbon dating, because the results can vary so widely that it's really hard to pin down certain things. For example, the Sphinx in ancient Egypt has often produced results that suggest that it might be much older than we had previously thought, something like 8,000 BC or 6,000 BC or 10,000 BC, 5,800 BC. And I'm open to that possibility that it actually could be much older, and that could open up the possibilities for pre-Egyptian civilizations, perhaps elsewhere in Africa, perhaps on some other continent before the Egyptians. However, by the time that you're starting to investigate the past in that deep amount of time, something like 10,000 BC, material, hand tools, pottery, structures, the foundations of structures, they're just left to be slowly destroyed by nature. And it's just, I think even Graham Hancock would admit, even if you were right about 51% of his work, there is so little that's actually going to survive from that time, just because nature just this material just deteriorates over time.
And
so
I'll just interrupt a second time here, if you don't
Sure.
mind. But and the one of the second claims that he sort of popularized, this is where you brought the young earth creation narrative, is the Great Flood theory, which is the idea that it wasn't this sort of, I think the term is gradual change, but there was a sort of great cataclysm. Now, anyone who talks about climate change, it's sort of funny, they don't really, for all that talk they talk about, but they don't think everything had to happen inch by inch in the past. There was no mega flood. So if you add in that, there goes all the buildings and papers and all the other artifacts that you'd look for. So I thought that little interjection would be worthy.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and that's a fair point. And, there are, I think it's, I think it's fine to state that there are cataclysmic events throughout history. And, even I remember taking an archaeology class at my university, and, we read the textbook People of the Earth by Brian Fagan. It's like a widely popular introduction into archaeology. Even the discussion about carbon dating in that book and another Brian Fagan book, I believe, I can't remember the title, basically talked about how, it just gives you a date range, and then you look into how wide the date ranges can be, and it's kind of flabbergasting because it's really hard to pin down. And there's all sorts of examples of archaeologists purposefully fudging the numbers on radiocarbon dating so it fits the general academic historical timeline that we have established. And by which I mean, the Sumerians came just a bit before the Egyptians, and then it was the Egyptians along with the Hittites and the Minoans and Mycenaeans, and this all happened at about like the Sumerians got started around something like 5,000 BC or 4,000 BC, and then things proceeded from there. So radiocarbon dating, or carbon-14 dating, I believe it's called, is just it's just, unfortunately, at the moment, unless we have some sort of breakthrough in scientific instrumentation, it's just it's hard to call it an accurate reading of the past, because the results vary too widely to paint a clear picture of the past. And I'm not saying it's not illegitimate either. I think it's actually really cool and really fascinating that we can do that with objects. I just think that that within any object that you're dating, sometimes there's not enough material from the past to give yourself a clear result of how old it is in the first place. One thing I'll say, that might be contra Graham Hancock, is that I guess that some of his work, I will say, so I would say that it potentially runs the risk of taking credit away from some of these civilizations if they really did create it. Like, for example, it could in fact be that really the Egyptians did build the pyramids there, and that we might, we shouldn't try and rob the Egyptians of their historical contributions, if indeed they really did create them. Now, to be fair too, I don't think Graham Hancock should just be this boogeyman of archaeology for going against that either. So, Now, I will say too that a lot of the times, academics are very defensive about defending their work because they've spent, they've spent a lifetime's worth of working on, a certain line of work, or they've studied ancient Egypt, or, the Assyrians, or the Egyptian, or, any civilization, take your pick. And they're going off of, quote unquote, the historical record, which is, basically colloquially referring to the collection of archives throughout the West and throughout the world that paint a general historical picture. And then when someone like Graham Hancock comes along, they start to get pretty defensive and irritated by that. I will say too that, it's possible to be a complete jerk and be right about something, and you can also be a really, really nice guy and be totally full of crap. Now, I'm not suggesting that Graham Hancock is, but it's more about the substance of the claims rather than the personality of the people involved. But I think one thing that helps Graham Hancock's case is that he's at least, he's almost like a really cool and interesting and really nice uncle, whereas some of these professors, have chips on their shoulders about this or that, and they're hard to connect with. So maybe that does academics a disservice by being difficult or rigid people, whereas, Alex Jones and Graham Hancock, they have these personalities that almost want you to be involved in their work or want you to consider these things in sort of a friendly, sort of contemplative sort of way. So that's just another thing I've observed about these two individuals and their relationship to their adversarial institutions, either the media or mainstream archaeology. I'll leave it at that.
One thing that with Hancock that Hancock reminds me of. Now, I don't know academic history as well as know academic economics, but it would seem to me that one of the reasons why Hancock is disregarded as much is because effectively he comes from a completely different, not maybe different approach. His approach is very different. Is that his sort of methodology and his sort of assumptions going in are wildly different from the academic consensus. I see him in a sense akin to, maybe I go as far as Austrian economics, but heterodox schools of economics who actually have completely different ways of looking at it from, say, sort of standard Keynesianism or neoclassicism. And what I think it highlights is the need to be clear about methodology. Was certainly the case in economics at a sort of academic level. Methodology is barely discussed in any meaningful way. Just sort of assumed and just carry on and do what economists do. And you sort of practical, you do stuff. But trying to figure out, the general approach, what is the right way to study this subject is not something that's ever really discussed in any meaningful detail at all. My understanding is some extent that's true as history as well. Now I know there's more sort of historiography. It's more sort of self-conscious. But there are sort of ingrained ways of looking at the world, sort of like the simple to the complex, the sort of uniformitarianism, sort of in sort of this is more referring to the flood stuff, which comes from the geologist Lyell, I think, in the 19th century primarily. Is that there are assumptions and ways of doing things that sort of like just assumed and are uncontested, and I think people like Hancock are very good for reassessing foundations of how we approach matters. And I think academic work in history and other areas would be much better if they were significantly more open about the assumptions and the method they are using, rather than just assuming, this is history, this is the way we do history. Because the way we do history, like referencing and stuff that is just incredibly anally retentive to today. Like in the 19th century, barely anybody did it. Oh well, it says here, Xenophon said, or Herodotus said. You could probably find it, but you didn't actually go down to go, oh no, it was at this point of Herodotus's collected works on line 372. The way that sort of history is done is hugely different. It doesn't mean saying history today is worse for that reason, but rather the method seems to have changed significantly. I mean, Mises, for instance, you mentioned Mises before. Mises barely references explicit. Well, he references people, but he doesn't give citation. You have to do quite a lot of work to find his site for like the actual work and where he's referring to, because that just wasn't the standard at the time. And that was written in like 1949. Now, this wasn't historical work per se. It was talking about human action. But I think that's the major interest, I think, with Hancock. On one thing with his wife is Malaysian, but she's actually Tamil, so she's sort of South Indian, so she's probably relatively dark. On the Jones racism accusations, they're ridiculous. He's sort of like a bombastic classical liberal figure who is very sort of constitutionalist, and he's been true to that vein of form since I've known of his work in the early 2000s onwards. So yeah, that's what my comments on my continuing comments on Jones and Hancock.
On our taboo topic episode, one of my first responses to Terminal was, can a society exist without taboos? And the answer is probably not. Probably societies need certain amount of taboos, but so which brings me to the question of, and I think these are two theorists, you want to call them theorists, figures, whatever you want to call them, who I think Swithin's comment about people like mirrors his sort of view on academic economists. Hancock's the outsider. And the same way with media, Jones is sort of the outsider here, running this sort of dissident publication here, talk radio show, sort of a lumpenprolet type thing. And one of the things I probably suffer from, which is either a feature or bug, is my attention span. I like to know a lot of things about a lot of different things, and some topics unfairly have a lot of depth in. But I would say that at minimum, if you want to know anything about the past, you should. I took an art history class in college. I did all right in it. But then, a year later, I saw this guy, Graham Hancock, and I did see him on the Joe Rogan. Then I went and bought his books. It actually got me to go to Egypt. Now, I knew the mainstream stuff within reason. I don't know every detail. And I had Graham Hancock. I think that's a fairly balanced approach to take. That's much better to approach than just saying, just believe whatever, mainstream state universities art history people say. I think that's a much more classical liberal approach. In the same way with the media. I mean, that's actually my take. And what's interesting as far as Jones is concerned is I think he's more aware of his role. I think Terminals say this than a lot of his critics like to point out. He knows he somewhat plays a character in a way, but I do think he believes it. Now, maybe Jones, the ultimate conspiracy, Jones is part of the CIA himself, so that would be the ultimate. And if that's the level of that's like the ground floor level of conspiracizing. But so my final question to both of you would be like, what is the role in the future of people like Jones and Hancock? I mean, should we cheer them on? I'm well aware there are charlatans or quacks out there who are just selling nonsense. I'm well aware, but it is funny if you investigate certain things. They're not as silly as they may come out to be. Like even the flat Earth, you can I figured this out. You can actually fly a plane around the world because it's just a flat disc. I think the ancient India, as in Indian subcontinent, believed that. It is sort of like a reputable model in a way. But what is the role of people like them? I mean, it might have been I don't think it was a total reach to put them on the same topic, but that organization sometimes is not my strongest suit here. But what is the role in the future you think should be for these people in maybe not in an ideal society, but at least in our society, in our current day here? Terminal?
Right. Well, I think the future of people like Jones and Hancock, I mean, I think the future is probably bright for folks like them, only because what I stated earlier is that a modern academia, I think actually rightly so, academia should gatekeep on certain, on certain subjects. That they should gatekeep against like outlandish theories that have no evidence whatsoever, and that's what archaeologists tend to accuse Graham Hancock of. I think that, I'll controversially say that I think that academia is okay to plant a flag or draw a line in the sand somewhere between what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. However, if it's so rigid to the point of where they won't investigate any questions like pre-Egyptian or pre-Sumerian civilizations, then I actually think that academia is doing also itself a disservice by not even considering the question, which seems to be the state of things. So something of a compromise between the rigid state of modern archaeology and something of the more, something like Graham Hancock, I think is not horrible. I think that there have been earlier archaeologists in the first half of the 20th century who were entertaining certain theories that Graham Hancock, I think, is sort of a fan of. I don't know, I forget the name of the 1920s archaeologist who believed in Atlantis, and that Atlantis was the origin point of all Indo-European people and languages and things like that. But he seems to sort of take some influence from that particular archaeologist. I apologize for not remembering his name. But so I think if academia wants to persist throughout the decades and the centuries as a legitimate place to become an educated person, a classically educated person, then I think that there needs to be some sort of effort in considering these unorthodox questions or unorthodox theories and see if there's some sort of legitimacy there. In the case of Jones, I'll say that, modern media is such it's such a bizarre freak show and it's in such a pro wrestling format. I mean, without sounding too silly here, I mean, what is the formula of modern media and news? It's something of the following. It's like, okay, so we just watched a Mountain Dew commercial, and now we'll pan to Rachel Maddow, and then she'll have a monologue for about 5 minutes, and you get to watch her big Adam's apple bob up and down, and then she'll bring on a guest who has the opposing viewpoint, and then they'll interrupt each other for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then she'll have a closing monologue, and she might tear up about something, and then cut to a Doritos commercial. I mean, this is just not a format for absorbing political science, history, politics, current events, sociology, anything like that. That is just an insult to the intelligence of most of the viewers. Now, a format, say like Joe Rogan or Alex Jones or anybody, really, you can name anybody, Vosh, ContraPoints, Eric Stryker, the whole circus, the whole clown car. Say whatever you want about any of those people. What is more appealing about their format is that you get to hear a sustained and more lengthy amount of time for these people to put their ideas out there. And it's not tied to any sort of corporate interests or money. Yes, of course, there's claims but that all these people, I mean, for example, like Caleb Maupin put out a book that says that, BreadTube, specifically like ContraPoints and Vosh and other people like that are actually, they might as well be U.S. assets because they are maintaining an anti-Marxist left wing, if you will. That's sort of the thesis of one of his books. And you can watch a great interview that Todd had with him, Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly. So, but anyways, say what you want about those people. And again, but, Joe Rogan, Alex Jones, et cetera, et cetera. But that format is much more interesting, I think, to the average person. And, and Joe Rogan has something like, don't quote me on this, I apologize if I'm wrong, but it's something like 100 million or maybe even 200 million listeners. I don't know if those are regular listeners, but he has something like tens of millions of downloads a month. So something's obviously going on here. And, if you ever watch the show Breaking Points with Cristobal and Sagar, I forget his last name, Engetti or something like that, they've reported, I think, quite well on, and they've quite convincingly, that mainstream media is just, it's never been lower in popularity, and podcasts are more relatable to the average person. And so I think Graham Hancock might have a harder time than Alex Jones because archaeology is a very specific field with a very specific set of existing physical evidence for certain past civilizations. But I think, he's made his 20 pieces of silver, and I think he'll have a good career. And I think there will be other people that come along in the non-academic archaeology like him in years to come. And then for Jones and others like him, I think the future is quite bright because the state of modern media is so awful and so poor and honestly so toxic that people are going to go off into the internet and find individuals who kind of suit their own politics. And thank you again for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. What I'd say about Hancock, as I mentioned before, I think foundational issues of how we generally approach historical matters of interest. I would agree with TP. I don't think the academic department shouldn't say this is true and this is false, and we shouldn't have any sort of gatekeeping in certain respects. But I would encourage them to at least have a public discussion with Graham Hancock, or anybody who gets traction. Just be willing to go out and discuss things with them, not necessarily in debate format, but in like a respectful sort of discussion. Because I think debate formats to a large extent ends up hamstringing the actual discussion, so you don't actually talk about that much.
Right. I totally agree. I totally agree there.
They just if you get them on and it's moderated and they're not going to be like deliberately interrupting each other all the time. And I think one of the reasons they do that on TV is because they're there for like 2 minutes or 3 minutes. If you think Joe Rogan is right, for instance, he's a respectful host and he asks good questions, and you do feel like the guy's actually been interviewed rather than being talked over. So I do think that's a much better format. So I would very much encourage the ivory towers, as it were, to actually engage with these people. Because otherwise they'll just become more popular even if they're wrong. Alex Jones is going to be good for just keep repeating things that are actually in the public domain and making people aware of them. Because he says, go and look it up, type it in, look, it's here, it's there. Because when he was on Joe Rogan, I can't remember if it was the last of the time before, they kept getting, Joe Rogan's sort of servant, I can't remember what he's called, who's like fact checking everything, and Rhino's like, yeah, it's there. It's there. He makes reference to
it's
things
in the documents.
It's in the document. It's there. But this is the whole thing. Going back to coronavirus, there's so much information. It's been known since the beginning, but people have just ignored it. What do we know? People with with comorbidities in the 80s, those who died. We knew that in March 2020. We knew that vitamin D was a correlate of that, but it was ignored. It was completely sidelined. No one would talk about it. It just couldn't be discussed at all. Alex Jones is good for bringing things up. This is there. We know it's true, but people just ignore it. And this is one thing Alex Jones, as I should say, is, look, these people, they're not conspiring and holding out this, keeping information secret. It's out in the open. It's there. Look at it. The thing is, they've just done a great job of making people ignore it. And that's why, because Alex Jones is such a huge personality and can grab attention, that is, I think, what he can do best. Look, Operation Northwoods was a genuine plan. Why do you think? Do you think somehow that the US government is somehow much nicer to its population than it was going to be in the 1960s?
I totally agree. Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt again, but yeah, you're right. A lot of the things that he does reference. Alex Jones, to my knowledge, I'll make this quick, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember in the earlier days of Alex Jones, in earlier 2000s, like around 2004 or so, I listened to him here and there. He was one of the only guys, I think, in media that ever talked about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in Vietnam, which happened decades earlier. But, I think if it weren't for Alex Jones, there would be far less public consciousness towards something like Gulf of Tonkin, because he would just constantly beat away at it and like, hey, people, look at this. This is crazy. And then, let's just see how crazy Alex Jones is. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a total this was a false flag operation. It was totally nuts, and no one talks about it. It's really frustrating.
And that's missing the biggest elephant of them all, which is the guy with initials JE with an island. This is, even people have like mainstream figures, relatively main, like Eric slightly heterodox figures like Eric Weinstein. It's like, wow, this guy has all these connections. WTF? Where did this guy come from? Did he hang himself? I mean, and he was talking about that for a while. So even Joe Rogan would point that out. So I think that's another thing he's just good on. He just exists, and he just sort of pisses off certain sectors of the managerial class. So I think that future is bright. But Swithin, that's it for my comments. But if you want to continue on Swithin, go ahead, go for it. Sorry for interrupting the interruption.
No, the interruption was good, and TP's comments is exactly right. Gulf of Tonkin. That I think is what Alex Jones is interested for. I mean, as an aside with Alex Jones, one thing he keeps going on about, which everyone keeps, has been completely memory hold, to finish, the mass shooting in Las Vegas, where somehow one guy got loads of ammunition into his room and started killing everybody when there's loads of cameras everywhere in Las Vegas. This is completely memory hold. Now, whether what the official story is true is another question. But it's at least weird that it's completely memorable, even though it was a really huge event. So that is, I know lots of people don't like Alex Jones, but I find him entertaining. And if you do listen to him, he is not stupid, and he does raise relevant and important stuff. Just have to thank TP for joining us again. It's been a great discussion. And if you've enjoyed this, please share and subscribe. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrime liberty show@gmail.com. That's mindcrime liberty show@gmail.com.